Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming out, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think our presentations are going to mesh seamlessly, which is great because we didn't actually know what each other was going to say before this. So I'm here to talk about my experiences of going from awareness about climate change to action about climate change, and hopefully do that in 15 minutes and have time for questions. As was mentioned, I have this funny role. I've worn lots of different hats in my life of trying to affect change on climate change. I currently wear two hats. So I was put into the House of Lords, as was mentioned, 2011. It was the same week that I gave birth. So it was essentially 2 life sentences in 1 week. Because you know, once you're in the Lords, you're in the Lords. And I'm currently migrating myself to be a crossbencher because I've realised I'm not actually that into party politics, and I just want to make things work. So, and I think the crossbench is a great part of our British democracy that not many people understand. Anyway, so I've had lots of different hats, private sector, started my own NGO, and I'm with the Environmental Defence Fund now because I set up Sandbag because I believed that actually we had lots of data and new technologies and new tools that we could use to have sort of citizen action around climate change. And I got involved in emissions trading and how you can use markets and capitalism to drive change. And we worked tirelessly at Sandbag, but I realised that the theory was we were going to apply a lever where we could have most effect. So finding those pieces of policy, those pieces of legislation where you can make a small tweak and have a big impact. And carbon markets is certainly one of those. But I needed a bigger lever. And so I've joined Environmental Defence Fund because essentially they were doing the same thing, but spanning across the USA, Brazil, Europe now, and China. And so the lever I'm operating with is hopefully now that much more powerful. So just, you know, I've put this up because I think people's awareness of the planet as a whole sort of started with this famous Earth rising shot where we took off from our little home and saw for the first time just how fragile this little blue planet is that we all live on, this sort of spaceship that's hurtling through the sort of through an essentially hostile environment, and yet we have this benign environment that we're currently disregarding and not protecting. And I think this was sort of really signified the start of the environmental movement, really, where people started to appreciate what we had and what we need to do to preserve it. What we know from sort of planetary observations currently is we're not doing a very good job of protecting this fragile spaceship we're all on. And the scale of the problem, and I think I won't go over this because Amy's covered it brilliantly, is exponential. And you see that the measurements we have of concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are rising, and the rate at which they're rising is also rising. So that's the reason for that horrible exponential curve that we're all still trying to work out how we can slow down and ultimately reverse so that that stock of greenhouse gases is reduced. So scientists are certainly aware of the problem and the Keeling curve has been monitored and reported for decades. And also, arguably, we've been putting out information about climate change for quite a while. This little clipping went viral a while ago. It's from a New Zealand newspaper in 1912, making the link between the burning of fossil fuels and coal in particular and the potential effect on the warming of the planet. I mean, it's been a long time, it's 100 years that we've been talking about this. Obviously, this didn't go viral at the time, otherwise hopefully we'd have done something about it. But this is a difficult problem. It's a hard problem to solve. And why is that? And well, there's lots of reasons, and people better able than I have looked at this in great detail. But one of the problems is that it's a tragedy of the commons. Essentially, nobody individually can solve this problem. And I've used this illustration of space debris in 2013 because I know we've got a space theme really about planetary scale observations and satellites. I mean, this is just a depiction of this debris that's currently circling the globe from our exploration of sending up satellites. And it's a good illustration of the tragedy of the commons because individually nobody is thinking about the collective impact of the stuff that we're chucking out into the atmosphere without any real thought as to what we do when they reach a problem, a level of being a problem. And I know people are trying to address this now because it is starting to have a financial implication, but the tragedy of the commons seems to be something that we struggle with. Anything that's a global scale impact that we're individually contributing to but not able to affect change causes politicians and general public quite a lot of heartache in terms of working out how to get from knowing there's a problem to actually acting, to doing something about it. But you know, whilst it's challenging, and I should also mention there's also another tragedy, which is the tragedy of the horizon. One of the unique things about climate change is that you affect change. You will have an impact today from your emissions, but the cumulative effect of those emissions is felt over a 30-year time lag. So even if all the politicians gather together and take action now, it's likely to be quite a while before you see the benefits of that. And there's a kind of hardwired, built-in warming period that we're going to experience really irrespective of what we do. So that tragedy of the horizon doesn't really fit well with electoral cycles that are no longer than 4 or 5 years, if you're lucky. So two parts of the really hard problem. But we did see quite an amazing breakthrough in Paris in 2015. And I think this gives me hope that we are capable of raising our game and addressing these problems despite the political difficulties. It was quite a unique period, I think, in that we had some really good forces in our favour. We had, for once, a president in the White House who was actually interested in effecting change, and of course we've reverted back now to normal US behaviour, I'm afraid, which is to try and pretend it's not happening. But you know, the US played an enormous role in Paris. Their change of mind and their engagement in active diplomacy brought on China, and China then coming to the table brought everybody else on, because really you saw from Amy's graph that China is the issue in many cases. There were lots of things that made Paris a success. The French diplomacy, the fact that they're a G8, G7, G8 country means that they know how to do diplomacy, and they did it extraordinarily well. We had this alignment of leadership around the globe. And I think it was, you know, a real testimony to all the people involved that this was signed. And also there was this realization, which started in Copenhagen really, that bottom-down approaches to dictating to people you will do the following wasn't really working, and that the divide between rich and poor countries was also an artificial divide that was long past its relevance. So in Paris you saw a real move towards a bottom-up approach, so countries were encouraged to come forward with commitments, and the idea was that you'd have a race to the top of people putting in ambitious targets and then ratcheting them up over time, which is what Amy talked about when she said there'll be a 5-yearly cycle of review. Also in this, there are two things about this that I think are really significant. One is the equation that it writes, so man-made emissions minus man-made sinks must equal 0 before 2100. That's a kind of an algorithm that you can get your head around. You can try and work on the different parts of it. We know the flow of emissions on an annual basis. We know the sources. We know less about the man-made sinks element, but that's a clear part of this equation, and you're seeing now increasing interest amongst academics, funders, NGOs around that part of the equation, because realising it now might be needed. And you know, we've got this slightly imprecise date by which we need to get to that 0, but you know, it could and should be possible if we're working on both of these parts of the equation effectively. You don't want the man-made sinks to upset your efforts on reducing emissions. So what you don't want is everyone going, oh, it's fine, we're just going to draw down all this carbon and store it. You've still got to reduce the flow to 0 or close to 0 to make progress. So Paris was a good step forward. Now, I like this picture because this is the Swedish Environment Minister in earlier this year, actually, June 2017, passing their version of a Climate Change Act, which committed them to carbon neutrality in 2045. And it was deliberately framed like this to show Trump up for being the misogynist that he is. So Sweden is probably at the forefront of taking the Paris Agreement and putting it into practical law and working out how to do this. Of course, Sweden is pretty unique in that it's a very wealthy country. It hasn't got that many emissions anyway, and they're very, you know, they can affect change on their own emissions relatively easily. But what they and others know is that in order to solve that graph where you saw from Amy of all these emissions having to reduce, the EU and other rich countries are not going to just be requiring to reduce their own emissions. They're going to have to pay for emissions reductions in other parts of the world who arguably are not at our level of development, aren't as wealthy, and are saying we need to have some scope for growth and we need inward investment to help us do that in a clean way. So rich countries taking action, it's partly about addressing your own emissions and showing it can be done, but it's also about paying and encouraging other countries to follow on different development paths. I'm a big proponent of laws and regulations. I was involved in the Climate Change Act, where we tried to set our own legal framework in place to address our emissions. And the reason I like them is because they have a a degree of permanency to them, and they create a kind of this, if they're written well, they can create a kind of legal metronome that keeps focus on issues. And I like this image because I don't know if you remember, but in June we were going through quite a tumultuous period in British politics, and you know, we'd had the referendum, and then we'd lost our Prime Minister, and then we were going through a stupid leadership battle. And at the time, these two characters were fighting out, you know, in various ways. And it was chaos, complete chaos. But at the same time, on June 30th, the UK government was compelled to issue its fifth carbon budget, which it had to do because it was required to in law in the Climate Change Act. And you know, in any other circumstances, they would have just kicked it into the long grass while this was occupying everybody's attention. But instead, they actually adopted it, and adopted it at 57% below 1990 by 2030, which is quite a stretch target, even for the UK, who's doing reasonably well on this. So laws, well-crafted laws that create legal deadlines and imperatives that politicians can't ignore, really do drive change, and can, if they're across the economy, get departments and other parts of government really moving to try and bring in policy. I should have said that another exponential curve that I like is the number of laws that have been passed on climate change. There are now 1,200 policies that have been passed in 164 countries, representing 95% of emissions that are on climate change. These are they could be as small as just a protective, a move towards an efficiency standard in a particular sector, or they could be as large as the Swedish Act, which is the whole economy committing to carbon neutrality. And there's been a 20-fold increase since 1997 in the passing of climate change laws to bring on new policies and bring in incentives. I have no idea how much time I've got, but someone will shout. Okay, 3 minutes, thank you. So anyway, why am I hopeful? Well, the reason I think we've actually possibly passed an inflection point from when we started to realise we needed to do something to seriously starting to work on it. And I think that was 2015. If you think back to 25 years before that, in the 1990s, the world was a completely different place. We were still running around with, you know, ridiculously, there was no mobile phones, nobody was on the internet, there wasn't a Facebook. The world has completely changed in that period, and the fourth industrial revolution, the emergence of ICT is a huge part of the economy. The emergence of the massive internet giants of the most highly capitalized companies now in the world are all IT related. That's just been a massive change. And if you think we've got probably 25 years left to sort of really seriously crack this, to get through those reductions, those halvings of emissions every decade, it's almost inconceivable that we won't have new tools for us to apply to the problem. In 1990, we started with the first laws to support renewable energy. In Sweden and in the UK, we passed supporting policies that would pay renewable generators. Fast forward 25 years and you've got offshore wind farms now in the UK capable of producing gigawatts of clean energy, coming in at price competitive now with standard generation. We've got subsidy-free solar all around the world. And the number of tools in the toolbox has grown exponentially, and it was really started 25 years ago. Next 25 years, I think we've got huge potential for making inroads into the challenge. And you know, the pace of policy change is, I think, quite amazing. We've just seen recently a big shift in electric vehicles. Why is that? Well, you can say it's because battery prices are cheaper, or because of Elon Musk, because he's amazing. But actually, what really has driven it is China. And China deciding that it was going to tackle air quality in cities with electric vehicles, and then finding it had a competitive advantage in the manufacturing of electric vehicles, it then decided to impose a tariff on other countries that they had to export a certain percentage of their fleet as electric vehicles. This had a massive impact on the European car manufacturing industry. Angela Merkel was phoned up immediately by all the car manufacturers to try and lobby to tell China not to do this, to drop this policy. And China said, well, we'll delay it a year, but you're still doing it. And that's actually what's happening now. You see all of these European manufacturers quickly running to catch up with China in terms of being able to manufacture at scale electric vehicles. And that's what's changed it. It was a policy, and it was a well-crafted policy that was WTO compliant coming out of China. So there is leadership all around the world at the moment. And I'm particularly excited about this because I drive an electric car and it's a nightmare today, but I'm sure it won't be tomorrow. Right, just a quick word on policy and why it matters. Certain sentences in bills matter, clauses matter, individual amendments matter. I've spent a lot of time trying to point out to the government that their capacity market was actually driving investment in diesel fuel generators because they hadn't looked at the policy in the round, and there was a loophole, and so suddenly we were not using coal, we were using diesel instead, which is, you know, not that much better. And anyway, we've managed to close those loopholes, we've managed to raise awareness. Similarly, the same bill with a couple of sentences killed off the onshore wind industry. Onshore wind is a hugely cost competitive industry in the UK, and the Tories don't like it, so they killed it. But now we're seeing with the new government a little bit of a resurgence, and with Ruth Davis in Scotland, maybe we'll see onshore wind coming back, which would be a good thing because it will save us all money and get the carbon emissions down. But this needs to come through law. You know, it comes through amendments and political processes, which is why they matter. I'm never going to get through the rest of the slides. Oh, I might use this as my last one. Politics is too important to leave it to politicians. They honestly have a brain capacity of about 3.5 minutes, and it's really frustrating that their time horizons are shrinking ever more. So they think in terms of tomorrow's news cycle. They're thinking about the next election, the next chance to go to the polls. They're not thinking in 50-year kind of time horizons of what needs to be done. So they need to be lobbied, and they are lobbied, and they're lobbied by those with vested interests in the status quo. They're lobbied by trade unions who represent jobs in their constituency. They get steel workers bussed into their offices to tell them, if you pass that law, we will be shutting our factories and putting this man out of work. So you've got to get involved. Civil society has to get involved in lobbying. You have to engage with the political system. You can, of course, decide it's all too corrupt and I can't stand it and I'm going to do something else. I'm going to make a widget that's going to fix the world, and that's where I'm going to focus. Brilliant, absolutely great, do that. But don't forget you're also part of this democratic system that needs your voice to be heard, and you need to get involved with the current political system and lobby to counteract those who are using it really effectively. I see them every day. I'm up against them in Brussels. They come, you know, they're in Westminster. It's not an accident that we have the laws that we have, and we need a counterweight. So it's really important to be a technological entrepreneur and to do brilliant work and to invent the widget of tomorrow, but it's also, you've got to make yourself heard and known in the political sphere, because we don't have that much time to reinvent politics. We've got to work with the system we've got. LED Sistine Chapel, only because I love this picture and because it just shows you that the messenger matters. So the Pope's encyclical, he made a massive impact on people I move around with who, when a Pope says something, they suddenly take it seriously. You can have no number of NGOs or green entrepreneurs saying it, but when the Pope says something, it matters. And he didn't just say something, he also installed LEDs into the Sistine Chapel, cutting energy bills by 80%. And anyway, and LEDs in themselves are a brilliant example of how things can happen because technology is just better. So anyway, you also go out and do this, and you can also use the courts, because ultimately we pass laws and then we use laws to sue them. That's what we should be doing if people aren't taking this issue seriously. EDF, Environmental Defence Fund's founding statement was "sue the bastards," which I love. They don't do that anymore. They use very clever policy analysis and economics, but at the heart of it is, this is unjust. We need to act. We need to galvanise ourselves, galvanise others, and put pressure on people to make a change, because it is a race and we are up against it, but there's loads of opportunity that we can make a difference, and I'm delighted to be here amongst some of the people I'm sure are going to make that a reality. So thank you very much.